Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ted Witzel, and I'm an artistic associate here at the Stratford Festival for our R&D. And I'm really pleased to be presenting and welcoming you to this afternoon's conversation, which is a talk with Dr. Amy Cook of Stony Brook University and the directors who are with us at the festival as part of the Langham Directors Workshop. Here in Stratford, we are on land that's governed by two treaties. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee to share and care for the land peacefully for many generations to come, as well as the Huron-Tract Treaty of 1827, which is made between the Canada Company and 18 Anishinaabe chiefs. This land is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, as well as the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Attawandarong. And today it's home to many Indigenous peoples who continue to call this land home, and the responsibility extends to all of us to share and care for this land and its waterways for the generations to come. It's a real pleasure to be presenting this conversation in partnership with York University. This is a conversation geared towards industry professionals and folks who are interested in the way we industry professionals are thinking about casting these days, and the various meanings that casting can produce, and how it sits as part of our task as storytellers. What stories are we telling, and how those are shaped by who is also collaborating in them, because of course the process of casting is as much about producing meaning as it is inviting collaborators into the room to share their perspectives. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Marlies Schweitzer, from the chair of the theater department at York University, to welcome Amy.
Thanks, Ted, and welcome everybody. My name is Marlies Schweitzer, and as Ted mentioned, I am the chair of the Department of Theatre at York University. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. And this area is also governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. It is my great pleasure today to be introducing Dr. Amy Cook, whose work on casting I have long admired, and this is the first chance we've had to host her. And so thank you as well to the Stratford Festival for collaborating with us on this event. Dr. Cook is the author of Shakespearean Futures, Casting the Bodies of Tomorrow on Shakespeare's Stages Today, Building Character, The Art and Science of Casting, Shakespearean Neuroplay, Reinvigorating the Study of Dramatic Texts and Performance Through Cognitive Science, and co-editor with Rhonda Blair of Theatre, Performance, and Cognition. And she has a number of book chapters in collections such as the Oxford Handbook of Dance and Theatre, the Oxford Handbook of 4E Cognition, the Routledge Companion to Theatre Performance and Cognitive Science, and the Cambridge Companion of Shakespeare's Language. So you might get a sense of how she brings together interest in Shakespeare, conversations about casting, with really cutting edge conversations about cognitive neuroscience. She is currently the Associate Dean for Research and Innovation and a Professor of English at Stony Brook University. So welcome, Dr. King. We're delighted to have you here today.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Ted and Marlies and Esther and all the amazing folks there making this happen. I'm really excited to have this conversation about casting and to join the incredible and important work being done at York and Stratford. My major aim is to sort of complicate how we think about casting and how we think about representation and building characters, because we're never blind to bodies and bodies always matter. But casting is also a very important way of telling new stories, as Ted said. So I will share my screen and begin. So I finished this short book on casting in recent productions of Shakespeare in February of 2020. I had just seen Ruth Negga as Hamlet at St. Anne's Warehouse in New York City. And then the world shut down. And luckily for me, directors stopped doing amazing work that I would have to incorporate into my book. But as we glance up now from that this global hellscape and start to see new theater, such as Stratford's R&J, I continue to believe what I argue in my book, which is that directors are using the bodies of the actors to reimagine our futures. And this is a follow-on to a larger book I had written in 2018 called Building Character, the Art and Science of Casting. And this investigates the sort of cognitive process of building character at the intersection of actors' bodies and texts and a wide variety of other pieces of information we bring to bear. So an actor walks on stage to play Beatrice, say, in Much Ado About Nothing, or Prospero in The Tempest, or Lear, or Lear, or Lear, or Lear, or Lear. And even before she opens her mouth, we're making judgments about what kind of Beatrice this is, what kind of love story based on the actor. We may wonder to what extent the actor's body or race or gender or body type will be relevant and in what particular ways, but we definitely see it. Directors can use casting to reflect the world that we live in. So there will be a variety of different kinds of bodies, races, and genders, just like most of us live in our life. Or the director can cast a body to counter our expectations in such a way that we're invited to challenge our categories for ruler, lover, or villain. So in productions of Shakespeare today, the casting of the actors is like the design revolution 100 years ago. So this is Edward Gordon Craig's design for Hamlet. And this is Robert Edmund Jones' design for Hamlet. This is his design for Macbeth. This is Brooks' design for King Lear. And this, of course, is his Midsummer. Almost a century of productions and theater history defined by extraordinary designs. But today, I think, directors are turning to the bodies of the actors to tell us how we are to understand these old stories. Just ask director Ravi Jain, who in his program notes for R&J says, quote, by changing the who of the storytellers, we see and hear a play in completely new ways, through new lived experiences and imaginations, building empathy for the unknown. So in Shakespearean futures, I argue that through the casting, we can see the future we are grappling with, a future that's paradoxically hyper attentive to the body while destabilizing the categories of race, ethnicity, gender, and the idea of the self itself and what a body should and could be. So how actors were selected to represent characters is very different now than it was 50 years ago or 400 years ago. We know, though, that experienced theater goers in Shakespeare's globe would have recognized right away that when Richard Burbage walked on stage, he was going to play the main part. We also know that there are moments in Shakespeare's plays where the actors are calling attention to the actor's body, or the characters call attention to the actor's body, such as when Rosalind gives her his epilogue, or Hamlet asks Polonius about playing Caesar, a play they were both potentially in previously. Today, the casting of high-profile Shakespeare productions or films will cast celebrities. This is particularly because the celebrity face will dramatically reduce the work required, the cognitive load to make sense of a character. I don't need to know much about the plot of Hamlet to know that this is going to be a funny scene. And I don't need to know anything about Titus Andronicus to know that the main character is going to make a very mean meat pie by the end. When spectators are trying to make sense of a complicated story or trying to keep track of a number of different characters, they offload some of the cognitive work to the actors. Our brains do this with important people in our life as well, our best friend, our mom. These are ways in which we reduce the cognitive load by condensing the information about the person. It's another form, casting, I think, is another form of dimensionality reduction, where we reduce the incredible complexity of our world by casting particular faces in particular roles. So casting right now, particularly as it relates to race, gender, and disability, has generated a tremendous amount of interest, importantly so, in the last few years. So, for example, Ayanna Thompson's book, Shakespeare and Race, was just published this past year. Kim Hall's book on race in the early modern period was also incredibly important. And there's Ayanna Thompson's work, Brandy Wilkins Catanese, Phaedra Carpenter, and many others on questions of race, Shakespeare, and performance, as well as Casting a Movement, the Welcome Table Initiative, edited by Claire Seiler and Daniel Banks, on casting as an inclusive project. And of course, York University's Resetting the Stage event earlier this year. So I want to start with the Public Theater's 2019 production of Much Ado About Nothing, not because it was the first all-Black cast at the Delacorte Theater, though it was, but because of how it was and also wasn't about race. In an interview, director Kenny Leon said that he began building his idea of the play around Danielle Brooks to play Beatrice. And speaking about how this Beatrice is different, both director and actor referred to both her color and her size. Brooks said, "I was sold because a role like Beatrice doesn't come around often for someone like me, a Black plus-size woman. It felt bigger than myself." And Leon said, "She's a beautiful, talented, plus-size advocate, and I wanted to create a Beatrice no one had ever seen before." Once she was secured as his Beatrice, he decided to place it in Atlanta during the 2020 election because he wanted to reflect an America that he hoped we'd have in the future. And I wanted to set it in a community that was embracing those values we stand for in America: gender equality, racial equality, and the fact that love always wins. So what the audience came to see was a story about today told by this community of actors through a play written 400 years ago in the past, set in an imagined future. Audiences knew it was 2020 America because of the large Stacey Abrams 2020 sign on the set. We also knew that the director had cast our real world political candidate of 2020 as a plus size Black woman at the start of a play we knew was starring a plus size Black woman. These bodies we know matter. Further, when Don Pedro and his men return home from battle, they carry signs that say things like, "I am a person," signaling that today the battles we must fight are categorical: who gets to love and who gets to be believed. This is different from colorblind casting that pretends that the actor's race or color doesn't matter. Instead, this approach to casting says that perhaps the original character's race doesn't matter. It's not that we don't notice that Beatrice, for example, is Black. It's that we don't care that she was ever anything but Black. Leon's production ends after the singing and dancing, with the men leaving in military formation with their signs. It's once again time to remind the world that Black lives love, laugh, sing, march, and matter. Where bodies are used by directors to cast against type, to change our minds, to stretch and alter our categories, I call it countercasting. Countercasting is casting that calls attention to itself. It's casting the wrong body, quote unquote, in order to change the conversation and alter the story. It can be subtle or radical, but it's always political. It counters our thinking and offers a new story for the characters and ourselves. Countercasting challenges the normality and invisibility of white, male, normative bodies. This doesn't mean it always works. I liked Ruth Negga as Hamlet, but I didn't think it was countercasting. She didn't challenge the story or tell it anew. She told it beautifully, but it didn't expand my category of who could play Hamlet. I didn't get to see Christine Horn's Prince Hamlet, I'm afraid, so I can't speak of the production, because it's not just a question of casting. It's about how the casting informs and changes the story. And again, just because Ruth Negga didn't necessarily alter the story by being her doesn't mean it wasn't a terrific production. It's just slightly different. On the other hand, the Groundling Theater's production of Lear with Shauna McKenna told a new story with an old play. McKenna holds authority well, so when she enters at the start to divide her kingdom, she does not seem wrong to be in charge. This Lear seems more wrong as a parent than as a leader, something perhaps many moms have sometimes felt. When she asks her daughters to perform the ridiculous love declaration, we're sad for all of them to have grown up with this cold narcissist. Despite the reviewer finding that Shauna McKenna reminded him of Clinton or Theresa May, I found no attempt to evoke the two leaders other than it was a white woman of a certain age. Yet this may be enough. We rarely get to see women of a certain age in positions of power that are not contested. This Lear is not a contemporary female politician who would have to smile and avoid being called a bitch. This is a female queen who is not afraid of her power or her leadership. As with her male counterpart, this Lear is undone by her daughters. When King Lear said, "I gave you all," for example, it's referred to the kingdom, the titles, the money. But when Mom says it, it refers to all. This Lear seems wounded and destroyed by the way her daughters insist that she is old and the ways in which life discards women of this age. This woman, this Lear, reunites with Gloucester by rubbing up on his leg in a masturbation gesture that asserts her sexuality and authority in a similar and similarly troubling way as some men. Seeing this old woman in the spotlight is different. It's radical. Our categories of leader, human, older woman must be expanded in this light. Glenda Jackson's Lear in March 2019, however, staged the possibility of an end to gender. She walks on stage, this small woman in her 80s in a suit and short hair. If it weren't for the fact that we're all there to see her Lear, it would not be clear that this Lear was a male or female. What is clear is that she's old. I say this not as an insult, but rather because women on stage and screen rarely look this old, rarely are this old, even if they occasionally get to be this age and still perform. Her performance was virtuosic, if not particularly nuanced. Her ungendered power came both with and despite her age. Jackson's return to Broadway to play this apex of male Shakespearean characters occasioned a lot of press. In each interview or article I read, Jackson is quoted as saying some version of, "Now, I wasn't interested in the gender bender aspect, but what I did find interesting is how age begins to fracture those absolutes which tell you what women are and what men are." Jackson is talking about the story her body tells without her psychology. It's not her individual experience as a mother or a father or a politician she is bringing to this performance, nor any actual feeling or response to any of those things. Jackson's portrayal of a genderless authority. Jackson's portrayal is of genderless authority, and this comes from the way her body can tell the story. Seeing this staged and possible, this seemingly genderless leader, invites me to imagine an epistemological chasm where the jealously guarded idea of self and gender dissolve, and what remains is the unaccommodated man. So disabled characters have not been rarities on stage or film, but disabled actors have been. The practice of actors pretending to have disability has generated critical backlash. As Rhonda Strukas has argued about the performance of Artie, a disabled teen in Glee, casting a non-disabled actor both missed an opportunity and also sacrificed artistic merit. To many in the disabled community, the actor's performance felt wrong. For example, he did not seem to dance in his chair like someone for whom the chair is an extension of self. When actors can pretend to be disabled like they pretend to be Southern or cowboy or on the run from the law, it suggests that disability is like a costume or an accent, something to put on or take off at will. The problem with casting actors who are faking this alternate body is that it limits what we can imagine or know about differently abled bodies. The casting of an able-bodied actor in the role of Artie, for example, allowed spectators to continue to believe that they knew what his experience is, that it was accessible to them with an imagination and a chair. But as Ali Stroker showed as Adu Annie, an actor for whom dancing, pursuing, flirting, and thinking always includes the chair she's in, this allows us to see the limits of character and of the human differently. It's no longer a metaphor of a handicap. It's truly a differently abled body. This then requires us to think differently about all bodies. In productions of Shakespeare, casting differently abled actors in roles that have not been traditionally marked as disabled or different can expand the community of people included in telling these critical stories right now. Sometimes, though, when the particularity of the actor's body shoots the play through with new meaning or resonance, it can also crack open an old play in a new way. The production of The Two Noble Kinsmen at the Globe in 2018 did not make me like the play, but it did provide me with an opportunity to dislike myself and challenge my assumptions. The story is basically about how the desire for one woman destroys a wonderful friendship between two princes, and the desire of another woman for one of these princes makes her go mad. The lesson seems to be that male friendship is far more valuable and noble than whatever is possible with women. As one reviewer noted, in its blithe misogyny, The Two Noble Kinsmen verges on being as problematic as the more popular The Taming of the Shrew or The Merchant of Venice, only without the redeeming feature of being a good play. Director Barry Rudder cast Francesca Mills, an extraordinarily talented actor, dancer, singer who is 3'8", as the jailer's daughter, the powerless and frustrated wench who loves and desires Palamon, the prince who does not return her feelings. She was praised by the critics. Her dancing and humor stole the show, though they did not comment on the impact of her body size to the experience of the play. When Mills, as the jailer's daughter, talks about the frustration and powerlessness of being a teenage girl in one of her 4 soliloquies, the audience hears it differently. As she says of her desire for Palamon, quote, "To marry him is hopeless, to be his whore is witless, out on it. What pushes are we wenches driven to when 15 once has found us?" After she joins the Morris dancers for an extraordinary performance before the court, all the dancers leave the stage and she is left on stage alone. She turns to follow them out the doors and the doors are shut on her, leaving her alone on stage. In the performance I saw, there was an audible "oh" from the audience that seemed to catch all of us off guard, the sound that would be made if a puppy or small child had been spurned. This, not the dance, was how the director chose to end the act. The audience audibly pitying this woman despite the strength and power she had just displayed in the dance. I rewatched this production about a year later to see if I could challenge my response or match it with others. And the audience had the same reaction, this weird audible pity followed by silence and then discomfort. I'm out on a limb here, presuming my reaction was shared, so let me just speak for myself. Catching myself demeaning her with my pity called my attention to my own ableism and invited me to rethink that reaction and those assumptions. Further, it shifted my perspective on the play because I began to see what Shakespeare and Fletcher depict as the moral and intellectual weakness of women as the misogyny it is. When the door slammed in her face, the character that I had built for her was suddenly unable to continue. And I was surprised to find the condescending compassion within myself that her performance heretofore had kept at bay. Her hyper-visible body and our hyper-audible response to it demonstrated that it is not love or the female sex or desire or rejection that is the problem. It's our narrow-minded reactions that need to change. Mills can never disappear into a role, as many have claimed is the mark of acting superiority. Her visibility creates a powerful reclaiming of an old role for a new kind of future where, for me at least, ableist and sexist assumptions are made visible and our categories of who gets to be loved and love and steal the show are expanded. Again, though, I'm not arguing that you can just cast someone who isn't white and male and suddenly you're doing something interesting. At the Globe in 2018, Nadia Nataraja played Celia in As You Like It, and Guildenstern in Hamlet. Both characters are part of a communicative couple. Celia and Rosalind have, of course, quote, slept together, rose in an instant, learned, played, eat together, and wheresoever we went like Juno's swans, still they were coupled and inseparable. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are practically thought of as one character in 2 bodies. Critics love Nataraja as Celia. Quote, Celia, Rosalind's devoted sidekick, is played by the enormously expressive deaf actress Nadia Nataraja, who signs her lines, only some of which are translated. So lucid is she as a performer that the character's intentions are entirely clear throughout. Her performance as Guildenstern, understandably, gets less comment. While I loved watching her on stage and thought that the idea of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern sharing communication was as rich in potential as Celia and Rosalind, I did not like her casting as Guildenstern. Primarily, this was because the need to translate Guildenstern's lines for the king and queen slowed down the rhythm of the poetry without really adding to the scene. When the hearing part of the audience has to wait to hear Faith, her private suite, translated from the sign, the timing is off, and we're left wondering why Rosencrantz and Hamlet need that translated. They don't. They're old friends. The translation is for the spectators, but with the joke ruined, we're left trying to find the thematic meaning in the line. When Celia's translations require waiting, our attention is brought to her and her efforts to keep up with Rosalind, constrain Rosalind, comment on Rosalind. Her voice becomes crucial, worth waiting for. And also, for those who don't understand sign language, this split between her body and the translator becomes an incredibly important part of the play and of the relationship. It generates ideas and possible interpretations for me with Celia, but it just doesn't work as well with Guildenstern. The two plays cast the same talented actor, the same use of language, but the dramaturgical and aesthetic implications were very different. By returning to characters we know well and staging with a body we were not expecting, we can make a bridge from the past to the future. A male Lear is what an aging leader and patriarch looked like. Now it looks like Glenda Jackson and Shauna McKenna. Seeing a Shakespearean comedy with an all-Black cast challenges the expectations what white audiences members have to see themselves everywhere, and invites Black audience members to see themselves love and laugh and sing and dance in Central Park. In the bodies selected to tell our stories, we can imagine a different future. Theater artists are providing us with opportunities to develop interpretive protocols that think about the story, the ecosystem, rather than the individual. I see directors using Shakespeare to shift our thinking from individuals telling stories to stories generating individuals. These productions invite us to reimagine what it can mean to feel and think as a group, rather than as an individual. It privileges the environment of the work's presentation rather than the backstory of the characters. This may not be the future of Shakespeare, but I think it's the future for us. Thank you. And I'd like to invite the Langhamites to turn on their camera.
Thanks for that, Amy. We're just being joined by Esther Junn, who's my colleague here at the Stratford Festival and director of the Langham program and artistic associate for planning, as well as Jamie Robinson, professor at the York University Department of Theatre. So we're going to transition into a conversation portion of the event. So we'll have some questions from the Langham directors and from Esther and from Jamie as well. If you're joining us on YouTube, you can chat in your questions, and by the magic of technology, Jamie will receive them. He's being helped with that by Marie, who is helping to moderate the chat and bring those conversations into this space. So I'm going to turn it over first to Esther and then to Jamie to introduce themselves. And I am going to disappear again.
Thanks, Ted. Hi, Jamie. I'm Esther Junn. I'm the director of the Langham Directors Workshop, and I use she, her pronouns. The Langham Directors Workshop is the program here at Stratford that recruits and places the assistants and associates in the various productions throughout the season. This year, we had 4 assistants, and I am going to let them introduce themselves, starting on this end.
Hey, I'm Sadie Epstein-Fine, and my pronouns are they and them. Is that all?
That's it.
Should Great. Over. Hi, Marie Farsi, pronounced she, her. I worked on Miss Run Ice Cream. Hi, I'm Sarah Clark, pronouns she, her, and I worked on the Red Sisters. Hi, I'm Christine Horn, she, her. I assisted on RNJ, and I think also, Amy, it's worth flagging that I was at Hamlet. I got really sweaty when I saw that picture come up, so I was like, I can't say about it. I just wanted to let you know, in case you didn't know, I was in your presentation.
Yes, that was completely intentional, and I wanted to include that production. It looks gorgeous, and I wish I had seen it.
Well, yeah, thank you, Amy, for such an incredible talk. Obviously, it's such an important conversation within our industry, and I mean, I guess for me, especially as a POC director, it's something that really I feel like has been going on through my entire career. But hearing it from you, I suddenly felt this great weight of suddenly responsibility in the sense of, oh wow, I never thought of it that way. It sort of was a thing that, I mean, that's sort of been in a way of casting a certain way has always been about survival in this industry. If that makes sense. So it's really interesting to hear it in the way you put it. I just wanted to clarify something because I wasn't quite sure, because you were talking about counter casting, going against type, and how the casting of, let's say, Danielle Brooks is not quite that. Like, I understand what you were saying about her, but then, I mean, isn't it all in a way counter casting now? Because we were trying to sort of go against sort of these, more Western European ideals. So I'm just wanting to clarify that.
Yeah, no, I think you've got your finger on an important issue. I think what I would say is I don't think it was counter casting, except perhaps because of her body size. Because I don't think that at this point, seeing an African-American woman play Beatrice is all that, it didn't challenge anything for me. But what was interesting to me, and seeing an all-Black cast was not, I mean, it was fantastic, don't get me wrong, but it didn't challenge what I'm interested in is these opportunities where we can bust apart our conception of a category that who doesn't remain there or who doesn't belong there. So what I was interested in with that production was it did tell this beautiful story, and they told it anew with these bodies, and that was incredibly important. But perhaps the one part of it that I would say is sort of counter is the use of a plus size woman, because that is just the idea of that is just still a little bit. It expands our categories of who gets to love, I think, still in a certain way, whereas I don't think that's completely still true. But I think it's I think it's an interesting and important point because it's happening so often. I mean, I can't remember the last time I saw a production of Shakespeare where there wasn't some kind of interesting casting. What I'm interested in is the really intentional use of an actor's body to shift our conception, to expand our categories.
Yeah. Which I guess very much is sort of what, Ravi sort of did with RNJ and also with Prince Hamlet, and that, sorry, I'm still focusing, and like I absolutely hear what you're saying. It's so funny. I think for certain demographics, I think for us in theater, it seems so normal, but I still wonder about the communities where it's still not normal. And I guess, so I'm just sort of grappling with that idea in my head.
Yeah. And again, okay. I think it's to me, the useful thing is thinking about Ruth Negga as not countercasting, because that is how a lot of Shakespeare is being done now. Her body belongs in that play. And actually, one of the things I saw Christine had said is that in reference to playing Prince Hamlet is we can get pregnant and we can play Hamlet. I mean, I think that category has been busted open. And so I think a lot of that is normal, but there are these moments where I think it does something more than just beautiful representation where it's actually shifting our cognitive categories. So part of this is because of how I think of the way we sort of build characters in our life as well as in the theater and film, is that there can be an accumulation of representation that starts to sort of push at our categories of who counts as a doctor, or who counts as a politician, or who counts as the president. But but there are these moments when it sort of breaks open. I talk about this joke that Jon Stewart told before the 2008 election, when it looked like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama was going to be running for president. And he said, well, how will Hollywood tell us that the movie is in the future if we actually have a Black man or a woman as a president? And I think that's so we have gotten to the point where seeing a woman as a president or a Black man as a president is not necessarily the future, but there are still these places where it starts to crack open, and we see someone. We have to really reconceive of what we expected in that part.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That makes total sense. Any questions or comments?
And I just want to jump in quickly. And if anybody has any questions, we're keeping this pretty casual. Just pop them into the question and answer, and I will respond to those as well and offer them to Dr. Cook. Thank you very much. It's very exciting. Go ahead, Langham.
Okay, I don't know if I'm going to be able to, how well I'll be able to phrase this, but I'm really interested in the idea of like the known, like Shakespeare as like a known entity, and what you were talking about, like with Richard Burbage, right? It's like, because at that time, the play he would have been in was new, right? So actually Richard Burbage being the main character, that was the known entity, right? They're like, oh, okay, I've got my main character, right? So now, obviously, that's why we don't need Richard Burbage anymore, because we know those plays so well. And my question is about, like, what is it about the known, right? Like, why do we still need to see, and why do we continue to put on these plays and continue to recast them? Is it because there is an element that audiences like about the known, right? There's comfort there, so that we can kind of, because to me, it's not cracking open the world. It's like a small crack, right? Oh, wow, Beatrice is this, like, we know the role of Beatrice so well that seeing Danielle Brooks there, we're like, okay, there's a little bit more I know now about that character. And I'm just wondering your thoughts about comfort and known and audiences, if that makes sense.
No, I think that makes sense completely. And I think it's a really important thing for us to think about in terms of directing, because we have the curse of knowledge. We know the play, we know the backstory, we know who's coming in next. But oftentimes audiences don't. And, I mean, think about the movies that we go to see. We may not know what exactly is going to happen in Mission Impossible 6, but we're pretty sure we have it down. I mean, it's details, right? And I think Shakespeare relied on the same set of knowns. The work that was done by the genre of the plays was tremendous. No one needed to wonder what was going to happen at the end of Hamlet. We knew there was going to be bloodshed. We also, we carried into that play a tremendous amount about revenge, and we have expectations about revenge. I'm speaking as typical Globe theater goer of 1603. Those expectations he twisted and made us wait for the revenge in a way that was novel and interesting. But we knew Richard Burbage. We knew the grave digger was played by the comedian, and we, all of those conventions that we go into theater with or films are really important, because it's a lot of work to keep track of stories and characters. And I think, I remember realizing I would get so irritated by yet another production of Shakespeare with some celebrity, or, you're seeing anything that goes on, on Broadway where the ticket prices are that high, you have to have a celebrity. And, I can be very, very dismissive and irritated by that. But at the same time, part of what I realized was most audience members need that shorthand to keep track of Shakespeare, because there's too much of it that is really, really difficult and then they don't know. So I think that is part. I mean, Shakespeare is this sort of cultural shibboleth. It's got so much capital, cultural capital, and it allows us to go back and play with it and provide a small amount of surprise. That being said, I will also say wholeheartedly that it's important that we tell new stories, and it's important that we tell new people's stories. And this can't be the only place where we're telling new stories and inviting new people on stage. It's interesting to me that we do it this way at all. And I think it is because you have a stable reference of something like Henry V and or Hamlet or King Lear, and it allows you to play with those ideas given today and tomorrow's men, women, and non-binary genders.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question or comment? I have a question. Hopefully it's a fully formed thought, but I was wondering if you could comment on the difference in building character when we're transposing the part to, a different gender in its totality, and building character when we're keeping the gender of the character as it was written, but with a performer that is maybe not identifying to that gender. Because I feel like when it comes to gender conscious casting, those are two different approaches. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on the play and what the director is interested in playing with. If we're asked to not notice the gender, then that's a different thing than if the director has changed or is telling the story about, let's say, a female Lear, or telling the story about a female Hamlet, versus telling the story of Hamlet and the actor, may or may not have, female, phenotypes. I think, again, our minds seek puzzles and meaning. And so we're going to try to figure out, like, what's at play here? What's the game afoot? If we've got, if they're, in the Lear production at the Groundling Theater, they switched it a bunch. They very, very clearly wanted us to recognize that actor was female and was a mother and was not nuncle. It was Nanti, I think, that the fool called Lear. And they were playing with it in a different way. Whereas in Glenda Jackson's, I don't think that the pronouns were changed. But what you were struck by was how uninteresting an exploration of the actor's gender was. So you abandoned that as a search for meaning and you started looking somewhere else. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yes. Yeah, it feels like the second approach allows, there's more freedom in it for some reason, when you're not forcing a gender onto a part that was maybe not originally imagined as that gender. And there's something almost like Brechtian in it, in the sense that there's like commenting happening from within, but it's not dictated to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, in Michelle Terry's production that season, her first season at the Globe, she did Hamlet and As You Like It, and she was Hamlet and Hamlet, and both productions were cast, I think, pretty. I mean, it seemed like it was not. I wouldn't say it was gender or race conscious. I would say it was sort of just open. And there were some beautiful happy accidents and some places where it felt like I don't get it. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with this piece of information. But there were places where you really were interested in the work that the body was doing at odds with your traditional understanding. And then there are places where it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's never occurred, seeing a female cast as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern is not going to cause any interruption to my, it doesn't, there's nothing I can play with there, right? It's not that it's not interesting. It's that it doesn't really comment on anything. It doesn't change anything. But, a male Ophelia had some interesting resonances. So, and whether I think it just depends. It's an ecosystem, right? I mean, you have to sort of think about the implications of the choices and how they work together. And it's hard to sort of say, this choice always works or this choice doesn't work.
Yes.
I have a question from the audience, if you don't mind. This person said that they also saw Nadia Nataraja in Hamlet and As You Like It and loved it. The question is, wouldn't the audience delay in BSL translation also call out assumptions and ableism, like your experience with Two Noble Kinsmen?
Well, I guess let me say this. I think that where that happened, that the director very consciously staged it. So I had that moment where I had a moment where my reaction and with everyone else in the pit happened. And the moment was staged, and our reaction as an audience was brought on stage very, very consciously. It ended the act. That gave me the time to notice my reaction and to think about it and to recalibrate. Again, this is where that for me, that beautiful experience of being in the theater and learning something about myself or the world, because I was wrong. And so not that there isn't just as much ableism with the sign language. And I completely agree. And I struggle with this because the Glenda Jackson Lear, also the Gloucester, was hearing impaired. And there are many ways in which it so enlivens a production and is so wonderful. But Nadia, for me, the issue there was that, again, I thought it worked beautifully in As You Like It. My problem was that it didn't provide me an opportunity to learn about my ableism in Hamlet, and it didn't provide enough of it didn't allow me to ask exciting new questions about Hamlet. It opened questions about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Hamlet and their relationship that didn't bear new fruit. Now, someone could persuade me that I was wrong and that I missed a whole exciting story that was being told there. And I'm totally open to that. But it was not clear to me that the ableism was the point. It was clear to me that it was very important to Michelle Terry, and rightly so, to represent the London that she sees around her, and that is beautiful and noble, and in many ways worked really, really well. It's just that it worked in a very particular way with Celia and didn't work as well with Guildenstern.
Thank you. I'll ask one more if that's okay, Esther, and then we'll go back to the Langham. This is an interesting one. In your view, what kind of director and actor training is needed to advance counter casting and other forms of innovative casting? Kind of director and actor training.
Well, I would like us to get brave about having hard conversations about who we are. For example, I'm sorry that I didn't announce my pronouns. That was cowardly of me. I think we need to be brave about saying what is it we bring to the stage, and celebrating that, but not pretending it's not there, and not pretending we can tell that. Well, because frankly, it's always the white bodies that think that they have a sort of all seasons pass, that they can play anybody, and so you get Scarlett Johansson, for example, saying that she could play a tree, and I just find that really problematic, and and so it's not necessarily that I think that I think we need to be really appreciative of the different kinds of bodies and minds that people our world, and have conversations about what are the stories we should be telling, and what does it mean to highlight a story from a different perspective. But in terms of training, I really like that question, because and I'd be really interested to hear what the directors have to say about it, because when I started talking about casting, people, I remember having this fight with not a fight, but an argument with a director where I was saying, you can't cast that person. And she said, well, I think that's the best actor for the role, and we're at a university, so we have to be really, I can't, I was like, no, you can cast that actor in a different part, but you cannot cast that body in that part. And the idea that they could just sort of, if they were a good enough actor, they could make up for it, I felt was not right. So that's the conversation I want to have, is being a little bit more aware of the way these stories are told. But in terms of training, I don't know how are you trained to do casting? Like how do you do that?
Anybody in the Langham?
I don't having gone through directing programs, there's no special course about casting, but I think, a director's job is to be creative, and casting, people need to be way more creative, and they really need to think outside the box, but they also, I always look at casting as a bit like a diamond, in the sense there are so many facets, and you're 100% correct in that when you're casting different bodies, you have to look at all the different facets. Sometimes it's great when you're just like, let's cast that person because they're the best actor. That just makes life so easy. But if you're casting somebody from a very traditionally marginalized community, you have to think about, okay, well, what are the actions that character does, and is there something within the journey of that character that goes up against like a stereotype or something? And for example, I saw a version of Hamlet where Richard was a very well-known Indigenous actor, and they made the choice that Richard wanted to get really drunk at the party, and that came in through rehearsal, and it was afterwards in performance that there was a lot of commentary about why that choice was made, and this is that very stereotypical. And and then this is, so that was an interesting thing, is I don't know, I wasn't in that process, was that thought of beforehand? And that was, because then that was totally something that came out of rehearsal. It was not put on this person and they made the choice. And that's what I when I say facets, there's just so many facets, and it's fine if you go up against them. I think that's fine to have these difficult conversations and have them happen. But it's great if those things happen within the room so people are prepared. Well, you know that's going to happen, and if that, you know, just so the actors prepare for that as well. But like, and that's why, so people have to start thinking in all the facets of casting. It's never just a straight choice, especially when you do sort of non-traditional casting. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I don't know if you can train for that other than we talked about this earlier, but really listening. And I mean, if it's not a community that you know, you've got to think.
Yeah.
Have some consultation. It's also very important.
I mean, something I'll say is that I actually graduated from York, but I graduated from Devised Theater, and this is like a shout out to Michael Grey Eyes. But in my training with him, he actually did do through viewpoints training, training about bodies in space and how different bodies tell different stories, by putting just like, again, without storytelling, just like putting different bodies from our class and his own body on stage, and us having conversations about what those bodies said and meant. And I still think about that. Like that was really, really great, to actually have those like open conversations. So that was really like useful. And this conversation I think is entirely, again, like when I'm casting now, I think about those conversations that we had.
Yeah, the other thing I'll throw out, but please, I'd love to hear more from you, is the idea of best, and that I think that we just like in other areas. I mean, I'm in academia, and I will have people tell me, well, you know, it's nice to it would be nice to diversify our faculty, but you know, we have to maintain our standing, as if excellence and diversity are at odds instead of necessary partners. So I think that when we think about what the best actor is, I think we need to look at our assumptions about how we've defined best, and to think about, well, how is the story going to be told if this person is telling it, and how do I help that person tell the story? And that's not to sort of diminish the importance of talent or training, but I think that we should also look at our expectation or our assumptions about best.
I think casting is starting to be part of the dramaturgical conversations that we have as directors, and that I'm really excited about. Like this notion of dramaturgy that is meaning making, and which, you know, I think is much more broader and inclusive as a definition of dramaturgy. And that really involves, you know, as you said, what it means to bring certain body types on stage, and the meaning that emerges out of you know, them playing certain characters. So I didn't have training in casting, but I feel as we understand dramaturgy a little bit, or I do a bit better, that casting is part of that reflection when I read and examine a play.
So have you ever envisioned a character in a way that you felt you saw the potential of a body or a type of actor different than what the words on the page seem to call for?
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm spending a lot of time on 12th Night, and after seeing the National Theatre's production with a female Malvolio, that's definitely something that I'm super intrigued by. So I'm actually doing a 12th Night with a female Malvolio, see what's going to come out of that, and trying it out with Sir Toby as well. Feste is also often a character that's fully transposed to a female character. But this idea of the villain that embodies, you know, the puritanical ideology of the time, and that being embodied by a woman seems counter. But there's something interesting in also having the character of Maria being so cruel towards another woman. So, yeah.
Well, I think it's particularly exciting if you think about Toby is also a woman, because then you have these sort of pillars of perspectives transposed. But again, I think it would be, but then you have all this interesting gender play elsewhere. So, you know, it would bring up questions for me about, so why are the other ones not, or what's being said there? But yeah, I think it can be really interesting.
Yeah, and it's a mystic, often described as a mystic and identity comedy, but it's really a mystic and gender comedy. So I'm also curious about, you know, what it would mean to have a female identifying performer play Sebastian, and, you know, have those conversations with performers around gender in that play. Yeah.
Great.
There's an interesting conversation happening in the question and answer with differing opinions of perceptions of shows and whether it worked for them or not. And just one example that leads to a question was from somebody who said, I saw R&J and there was something about the attempt to reframe that felt like it altered the crux of the story. So in your view, how deep can we go with reframing as a strategy of adapting from the center outwards or altering the DNA? So I guess the question is, yeah, how far can we do this before we lose? And then there's a follow-up for another person. Are we just replicating harmful systems from Shakespeare? What's our role in that?
Yeah, very good questions. I think what I would say about how far can we go is, you know, Shakespeare isn't here to stop us. We can go as far as we want. I do think at a certain point, like, well, why use Shakespeare then? Like, I am a big fan of new plays and playwrights being supported. So, you know, there is maybe a limit, but I don't necessarily believe that we need to police Shakespeare's, the integrity of his work by any means other than just sort of our own artistic vision. What was the other part of the question? Oh, was about reproducing. Yeah, I do think we need to be aware of the fact that Shakespeare comes with this huge cultural capital and some seriously damaging elements. But I think the kind of reverse discourse of walking inside there and using it for how we want can't be helpful. And again, partially because it's known and it had its status, and so you use that for your new stories and to your advantage. I will say that I've seen one version of Taming of the Shrew that I didn't find horribly offensive, and I don't need to ever see another. I'm very happy that someone managed to do it, but I don't think anyone, it's not something I want. So I think it is important to recognize that many of the works, I think, the plays are structured to work against how I want story or how I want people treated now. So some of them I don't think I would want to see or try to see recaptured or reframed, but some of them are really great ways of intervening in conversations now through new bodies and old characters.
I have to ask Steve, because you worked on R&J.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I was gonna actually jump in there too. I guess I just want not to defend it, but just to explain the route from casting to the production of that one, because it started with Alex Bulmer, who was the actor who played the friar, and she is a blind artist. And the first draft of this, what turned into R&J, was really just a cut version of the play. And it was going to be, it was always going to be designed for sighted and blind and low vision audience members. And so the thought was that it would be everything would be very oral. There would be an empty stage. We just listen to the text and sort of get it that way. We did a workshop in March, and right away on this empty stage, Alex Bulmer, the actor playing the friar, was like, I have no idea where I am because I can't feel anything. There's nothing on this stage. So I'm completely lost in space. So I co-adapted the script with Ravi Jain. So that made us, her not knowing where she was. And also at the time, we thought there was gonna have to be all these COVID distancing things, which meant nobody could give Alex an arm. And it's very dangerous for her to try to get off stage. So we thought, okay, this is our friar. We wanna center her experience. So we have to create a version of Romeo and Juliet where the friar is on stage all the time because this actor can't get off, and they are in a space that they're completely comfortable with. So that led to this play takes place in the friar's home. The friar's always on stage. So how do we tell Romeo and Juliet within that structure? So we didn't set out at the beginning, we didn't like write an adaptation memory play and then cast an actor. We started with that actor, and this is the play that came out of that. And I hear that does it change the story? Like 100%. Like are there different, is it a different perspective on that? Definitely. You know, I also think like you can watch the other version on the Stratford website, like right now, like there are these you know, why not? If we are going to keep doing these plays, why not shift the perspective? And we also were building that airplane as it was flying. So we you know, so really like right up until it was a new play. It was a Shakespeare new play at the same time with like 3 weeks of rehearsal in a pen. So it was, I think that you are right. Whoever asked that question, you're totally right about it does shift things. For me, the things that the gains, I think for me outweigh that. If we get an opportunity to do it again, are there story things that we would probably tweak and clarify? 100%. We would also dial up the, there was audio description embedded in it for our blind and low vision audience members. That we would work on that more. There are things that we would keep working towards. This is sort of as far as we got in the time that we had. But you know, it all really began because we wanted that actor in that role, and so the whole show grew out of that opportunity.
And what was it? What was it like? To re-see that play, being an unfair word, but to remake sense of that play from an actor's perspective who was blind. How did you learn about, what did you learn about the play in that way? And I'm not being contesting. I'm truly interested.
Yeah. It was interesting for me watching it. You know, we sort of get to the end of that play and we assume, you know, it's like the parents are gonna like erect their statues, and then there's this like monument and this sort of physical thing. And when it became in our story with the friar actively remembering these things, it for me changed the memorial, I suppose, and then the remembering became the memorial. The talking about it or being visited by these things, instead of like, I'm going to make a gold statue. No, I'm going to make a gold statue, and now we have these gold statues, and who knows? Those families could just keep fighting. Who knows what they did after the end of the play? But it for me changed. I was aware of the remembering of it and the importance of remembering this story and these two kids.
That's beautiful. I also love how the integration of audio description calls our attention to something that we don't usually do. So and again, I didn't see it, but from what I read, just the actors having to describe what they looked like was such a powerful, just delightful thing for me, because you are allowing them to sort of provide your image of them to you. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Totally. Oh, I can share something quickly. I don't really have a fully formed thought on this one, but I guess I was struck by, in the conversation, when we think about how we're making stories, whether it's directors or playwrights or actors, what we're doing in terms of like, when we're approaching identity, and those categories are so different depending on if it's gender, sexuality, race, class. I mean, the way that we come into those categories is different. And I guess I was really thinking about like when the choices we make about when we need to represent versus transcend. So like when we're foregrounding representation and why that's important for certain stories versus when we're trying to actually somehow, if this is ever possible, I don't know, transcend the category of identity in the name of kind of creating these not yet created futures. And I don't really have anything concrete, but I just wanted to share that distinction in case it was maybe interesting at all for someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. I think that I would in general push back against representation as a goal, because I think because I think that the art and necessitates diversity and different bodies, and I think we should follow the art. And again, it's important that we are devoted to art and envisioning and telling stories about the world that we see and the world that we want. And that should lead us to incorporating new bodies, new stories, new people. I'm hesitant about representation as a goal. Though I have to say, if I were talking to a bunch of Hollywood CEOs, I might say it may make a different argument. But in the theater, I think we can't be excellent if we're not telling new stories and looking at new bodies or bodies we don't expect, or we're not seeing diverse representation of who we are. So that's my first impulse.
Somebody responded to the RNJ, just a little comment after, just in terms of what their perspective of it was about reframing the play, is that it was about reframing the play, offering a new perspective through the eyes, in quotes, of a blind friar. It caused me to reconsider things like love at first sight, seeing the future, having a vision, which I think speaks to, Shakespeare has had the advantage of 400 years to allow us to make these decisions, which is maybe different than more modern plays, right? In terms of like the last 50 years, how far can we reframe plays that were written 50 years ago? Maybe those ones still have to live in where we're at now. Yeah, and then my question, and I'll turn it over to Langham for a few more too, is and it came up with CEOs in Hollywood. What directors have the authority to make certain casting choices? When do they have to step back and say, you know what, this choice is not for me? When do they have agency in that kind of decision process?
Well, I think that if you're the director, you have agency and you have to take responsibility for the choices that you're making and the story you're telling. And you can't, if you don't want responsibility for the choice, maybe you should tell a different story. I don't know. Do you all have thoughts? I mean, I'm hesitant about that because I do think that we can be so identity first in terms of like, if you know, whatever, if you are if you have some essential identity, then you get to tell the story, and then we lose all critical rigor. And just because, well, I happen to have the identity, you can't critique me for telling the story. Whereas someone can tell a really important story about someone that's not, doesn't fit their identity, and that's more important to me than the identity makeup of the author. But I realize that's nuanced. And
I think you said it there with responsibility, right? It's just it's a huge part of the director's job. Christine, I see your hand.
Yeah, I want to say too, in terms of when you are allowed, when a director can make those choices, thinking about something like R&J, having a blind actor, there are courses that there is cost sometimes to casting an actor who might not normally be there. If you're working with a deaf actor, you need interpreters, and interpreters cost money. So there are, I think probably, you can bump up against an institutional structure that's going to say you cannot have that actor because we cannot afford the support, and that sucks. But that's that question, Jamie. I went there to like, there are, I think there probably are that are beyond whether the director wants to tell that story or not. Sometimes the institution making that a priority and a value.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the Langhams?
I don't know if this is a question, but you know, I know original practices are still a thing at the Globe, and I wonder what, you know, how relevant it is.
I love that. Well, I will say that the original practices are not interesting to me in and of themselves. I will say that the production, Mark Rylance's production of Richard III and Twelfth Night were pretty fantastic, despite the fact that, you know, he was certainly not the right age to play Olivia. But I learned so much about Twelfth Night by watching it with all men, and one of the things I thought of and was mentioned about the R&J production is the age of the actors, and I think we fail to recognize that, and largely it's because, you know, try finding a 15-year-old who can manage some of these characters. But the original practices don't interest me quite as much, but I will say that some of Shakespeare's plays, when all of the actors are male, they're just alive in a different way, because I think that was how Shakespeare was planning on those bodies, and you can see him playing with those bodies. You know, that one of the first things I became interested in was the scene between Hamlet and Olivia, where he calls attention to her, you know, her country matters, and then goes on to say, well, there's nothing between your legs. And this is an incredibly sexy and charged scene, particularly if it's two boys or a man and a boy. And there are a number of things like that where, as much as I miss having women on stage, it can be really incredible. And I will say that Phillida Lloyd's all-female productions similarly have an exciting energy, because there are certain things you hear about the text that because of that it was written for that a kind of a gender cline rather than a gender binary. That's what I would say. I would say that I think Shakespeare was writing for a far more nuanced cline of gender, whereas we so think, I mean, least until relatively recently, we're still pretty stuck in a binary, and that doesn't work as well for Shakespeare.
Great. We have one more question here, and it just came in, so I'm just going to read it and follow along. I'm keen to push back against the idea of the audience as a sampling of our culture, of a culture as a monolith, and thereby asserting that meaning making can be singular. Black audiences, Indigenous audiences, queer audiences, urban audiences, rural audiences, these groups are all going to read works differently. I'd suggest refining that idea to meaning making. How can we challenge our own assumptions about an audience's cultural frames of reference and how we're dialoguing with them to produce meanings in a way that decenters dominant culture? It's a big one, and we have 4 minutes. Go.
I think that's it's totally true. And I think that, so for example, when I think about Mark Rylance as Richard III, I come in with a whole lot of information, both about Mark Rylance and about Richard III and the bones and Mark Rylance's ridiculous speech at the Tonys. Like that is a rich, wide, and also peculiar set of stories I bring to that. Very different from other audience spectators. And so it is very important not to recognize that it's a monolith. What I will say though, is diverse as the meaning makings are, as a director, I think it can be useful to say what's in the horizon of possibility. And I do think decentering the sort of dominant story narrator position can be really important. The question of how we, take apart sort of white supremacy and sort of that, I think about Tom Stoppard, who said, if I was sitting and typing at my desk and there was a revolution outside, I'd go and get a gun. I wouldn't keep typing. So, I mean, I think it's really important work that we need to do. And also it's only a piece of the work that we need to do as citizens to deconstruct the sort of white supremacy, hegemony, and the way in which those structures have continued to tell the same boring stories all over again. But it is definitely important to keep in mind that different audience spectators will create different characters. But I think having having a creativity to imagine the sort of horizon of possibilities that a spectator is going to bring to an Indigenous actor playing a Gertrude who's drunk, is gonna at least recognize that maybe that's not one of the stories you want to tell about that play. How'd I do?
You got it. Right under the wire too. We have time maybe for one more from the Langham group. Do you have anything? I can jump in with one more. It actually came up through Christine talking about R&J, but this whole notion of auditions must be changing now too, right? Is it our job as directors to see something in the audition process where we can change our own perspective on how the show may be, rather than imposing something on it? Because quite often now it's quite common that it's invited that anybody can audition, and we're encouraging that. So you might see something in the audition process. Is that also something in terms of the director's responsibility?
Yes, and if you're changing the audition practices, then I would assume that would change the production, a lot of other elements of the production schedule. I mean, because normally the way the sort of business of theater works, there are a lot of things that get set in stone before you go to that audition. And so, we have to rethink a lot of that, or at least sort of make allowances for it, that what are the parts of, what are you assuming in, you know, I'm going to tell a story of Twelfth Night, and it's going to be set here. Or like, what are the decisions we set in stone first? And I think part of what I would say is that the production world, the sort of mechanism, the business of theater, has been developed to privilege the designer, partially because the designer takes, it has to get built, and it's often very expensive. But you might make very different decisions if the casting came first. And so I think that, but I certainly think it's important to make sure you're clear about what are you assuming when you're setting one thing in stone, and what are the lessons you learn along the way. As you learn, like, you can't design a set with nothing on it if you're going to cast seeing impaired actors. That's not going to work. So, you know, again, our systems, our business structures, our production schedules also should probably adapt to the needs and the requirements of the people whose bodies we want on stage.
Right, and you made that clear with the Much Ado About Nothing. By casting that one actor, we're going to be in Atlanta, and this is how it's going to go.
Right.
Yeah, Jamie, within theater, a whole culture shift has to happen from the place that we pick. Down, you know, before we even get to casting, there's so many things. Like, you know, here at the festival, we're trying to shift all sorts of things. We're talking about work-life balance, like reverse schedules, all these things it's all part of it as we try to shift, I guess, to more, you know, equitable industry. And I think it's a long way to go still, but
yeah,
it's an entire system. We're talking about systemic things, right? It cannot just be one thing, and it's not.
That's so right, Esther, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because I mean, again, we're in partnership here with York University, and the universities then reflect how the theater businesses go, and so you know, it is, that structure is deeply ingrained in the university training system to perpetuate a system that may not work. 12 out of 24s don't work for, you know, a lot of actors, certainly. And if we're going to expand into sort of neurodivergent actors and audience members, and if we're all going to recover from this pandemic, we also need to rethink how work happens in general. Like, all of that structure has to be on the table to change, I think.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like we're just at time, and Ted has popped in just in time. Thank you, Dr. Cook, and thank you, Langham Lab.
Yes, thank you so much.
With that very easy and manageable prompt for starting the revolution now. Thank you for taking us there. That's the jumping off point for the work to be done, moving out of this conversation and back into the universities and into the theaters. That's a really nice note to end on, like the deep level of structural integration that happens between these various moving parts and how we create and tell stories. Dr. Cook, I really want to thank you for your time with us today, and Marlise and Jamie and Esther and the Langham directors. Thank you all for a really lively and engaging conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.